Once a successful accountant, Claire's life spiraled into addiction and homelessness, until one stormy night changes everything. She discovers two terrified toddlers abandoned in a duffel bag, thrusting her into a deadly conspiracy involving a powerful human trafficking ring. With ruthless criminals closing in, Claire must navigate betrayal, outsmart corrupt officials, and risk everything to protect the children. Claire sat on the damp pavement, her back against a graffitied wall, staring blankly at the stream of pedestrians who walked past without a second glance. Their hurried steps, the rustle of shopping bags, and the low hum of conversation filled the air. But Claire remained detached, lost in thoughts of a life that once seemed so far away. There was a time when she wore crisp blouses, worked in a brightly lit office, and her days were filled with spreadsheets and meetings. As an accountant, Claire had built a life of routine, stability, and order. But that life had been shattered, piece by piece, by the slow creep of addiction. What began as a way to ease the pain of betrayal, her husband's infidelity, the sudden collapse of her marriage, soon spiraled into something she couldn't control. She glanced down at her hands, calloused and rough from months of scavenging. The world had become a harsh place, a maze of survival where food came from dumpsters and warmth was found only in the shadows of alleys. Every night was a battle against the cold and the violence that lurked just out of sight. Each corner carried the threat of danger, whether from other desperate souls or the authorities that turned a blind eye. She pulled the thin coat tighter around herself, trying to stave off the evening chill. A pang of hunger gnawed at her stomach, but the thought of diving into another trash bin made her heart sink. She'd already been through most of the nearby spots earlier, finding little more than spoiled leftovers and half-eaten sandwiches. Food was always a gamble, and tonight she was losing. Yet, amid the squalor and isolation, there was something that still flickered within her, a dream, though faint, of redemption. Every night before she closed her eyes on the hard concrete, Claire allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would bring something better. Maybe it was foolish, she thought, but that sliver of hope was the only thing that kept her going. The streets had changed her, hardened her. She had learned to navigate the world differently now, moving quickly and keeping her head low to avoid trouble. She had allies, other street dwellers who knew the same struggles, like Marcus, a man she'd known from the early days before everything fell apart. He ran a small, hidden shelter that offered warmth to a select few, but Claire seldom went there. She hated the feeling of dependence, the sense that she was too weak to make it on her own. The sound of a nearby argument pulled her from her thoughts. A group of teenagers was causing a scene across the street, pushing and yelling at each other. Claire instinctively shrank further into the shadows, unwilling to be noticed. In moments like these, the city felt more dangerous than ever. As the commotion died down and the teens moved on, Claire exhaled slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep living like this, on the edge of society, unseen and uncared for. Yet, deep down, a stubbornness remained. She would survive. If not for herself, then for the faint glimmer of something better, somewhere out there. For now, though, survival was all she could focus on. Rising from her spot, Claire slung her backpack over her shoulder and began her usual nightly routine of searching for food and shelter. The night had only just begun, and there was still much to do. The storm was relentless. Rain lashed the streets in sheets, turning the already cold city into a miserable, gray blur. Claire's clothes clung to her body, soaked through, and her hair was plastered to her face as she trudged through the back alleys, searching for shelter. Every step splashed water from puddles, each breath visible in the cold night air. She shivered uncontrollably, the threadbare coat offering little protection against the elements. She rounded a corner near the industrial part of town, an area full of abandoned warehouses and forgotten structures. It was quiet here, too quiet, save for the howling wind and the occasional rattle of loose metal. Most of the buildings were boarded up, left to decay. This part of town wasn't frequented by many, but for Claire, it meant fewer people, less trouble, and a chance to rest without being disturbed. As she ducked into the narrow alley behind one of the old warehouses, something caught her attention. Over the sound of the storm, She thought she heard something else, a faint, distant cry. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination or the wind playing tricks on her, but then she heard it again. The unmistakable sound of children crying. Claire stopped, her heart pounding in her chest, and scanned the area. It was pitch black except for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the alley in brief, eerie bursts. She strained her ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the cries. There it was again, clearer now. A child's cry, muffled but nearby. She hesitated, unsure of what to do. Children? Here, in this god-forsaken place? It didn't make sense, but the sound tugged at something deep inside her, a primal instinct she thought long buried. Without another thought, she moved toward the sound, her feet splashing through puddles as she approached an old, rusted door partially ajar at the back of the warehouse. Pushing the door open, Claire stepped inside. The interior was dark, filled with the stench of dampness and mold, but the cries were louder now, echoing through the empty space. She fumbled for the small flashlight she kept in her backpack, clicking it on and sweeping the beam across the room. Boxes and debris were scattered everywhere, and the rain leaked through cracks in the ceiling, creating small pools on the floor. Then, in the far corner, something moved. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the light fell on a duffel bag. Large, worn, and zipped shut, except for a small gap at the top. From within, the muffled cries grew frantic as she approached. With trembling hands, Claire crouched beside the bag and carefully unzipped it. Her flashlight revealed a sight that sent a wave of shock through her body. Two toddlers, no older than 2 or 3 years old, stared up at her with wide, terrified eyes. Their small faces were streaked with tears, their clothes soaked and dirty. For a moment, Claire froze, overwhelmed by the horror of what she was seeing. Who would leave 2 children in such a state, abandoned in a duffel bag, in the middle of a storm? Hey, it's okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. I'm not going to hurt you. The words felt strange in her mouth, as if she hadn't spoken to anyone gently in a long time. One of the children, a little girl with curly hair, whimpered and reached out a tiny hand. The other, a boy, clung to the girl, his eyes filled with fear. Claire's heart ached as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the girl's hand. It's okay, she repeated softly, trying to soothe them. She looked around the empty warehouse, her mind racing. Whoever left these children here could still be nearby. They could come back. She needed to get them out, and fast. Gathering her resolve, Claire gently lifted the children from the bag, one in each arm. They were light, far too light, and their small bodies shivered in her grasp. She had no idea what to do or where to take them. She was barely surviving herself, but she couldn't leave them here. There was only one person she could think of, Marcus. He would know what to do. With the rain still pouring outside, Claire hurried back into the storm, clutching the children close to her chest. Their cries had quieted, but they remained wide-eyed, their tiny bodies trembling against hers. She had to move quickly. The shelter Marcus ran was hidden, off the radar to avoid unwanted attention. It was a place for people like her, who needed somewhere to hide from the world. It was the only safe place she could think of. The journey felt like an eternity. Each step through the storm was a struggle, and Claire's body was already weak from hunger and exhaustion. But she pushed on, driven by something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. The children needed her, and for once, her survival wasn't just about herself. When she finally reached the shelter, an old, run-down building tucked between 2 larger ones, she banged on the door with her foot, holding the children tightly. Moments later, the door creaked open, and Marcus stood there, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "Claire? What the hell?" he started. But his words trailed off when he saw the children in her arms. "I found them," Claire gasped, her voice hoarse from the cold. "They were abandoned, in a bag. I didn't know where else to go." Marcus stared at her for a moment, then quickly stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "Get in here, quick," he said, urgency in his voice. "We need to get them warm." As Claire stepped inside, the warmth of the shelter enveloped her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, She felt a glimmer of hope. But as she looked down at the terrified children in her arms, she knew this was just the beginning. Whatever had led to these children being abandoned was far from over. The warmth of the shelter hit Claire like a wave as she stepped inside, dripping rainwater onto the worn floorboards. Marcus quickly guided her to the back of the small, hidden refuge. It was nothing grand. A few beaten-up chairs, some old couches, and a makeshift kitchen. But it was home to those who had nothing left. Tonight, however, Claire's concern wasn't herself. The two children clung to her, their small bodies still trembling from the cold and fear. Marcus grabbed a towel from a nearby shelf and handed it to her, his expression tight with worry. "What the hell happened, Claire? Where did you find them?" he asked, nodding toward the toddlers in her arms. "I don't know," Claire replied, her voice shaky as she wrapped the towel around the shivering children. "I heard them crying, in a bag. Someone left them out there." In this storm, Marcus ran a hand through his graying hair, his brow furrowed. "In a bag? Jesus." He crouched down to the kids' level, his voice softening. "Hey there, little ones, you're safe now. We'll get you warm and fed." The children didn't respond. They huddled close to Claire, their wide eyes darting around the room, still too frightened to relax. Marcus sighed and stood up, looking Claire in the eye. "We'll need to get them some dry clothes. There's a box of donated stuff in the back." Claire nodded, her mind racing. Who would leave kids like this, Marcus? Who could be so cruel? Marcus didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the door as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment, then shook his head. "I don't know, but something doesn't feel right about this." As Claire held the children, she couldn't help but agree. The whole situation felt wrong. Sinister even. There was a heavy silence between them as Marcus disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a pile of dry clothes. Together, they gently dressed the toddlers, the little girl and boy still too stunned to speak. "Do you think they'll be okay?" Claire asked softly as she tucked the boy into a makeshift bed on the couch. His little hand instinctively reached for the girl, who lay beside him, their small fingers entwined. Marcus nodded, but with hesitation. Physically, they seem okay, but who knows what they've been through? As they worked in silence, Claire's mind wandered, trying to piece together what might have happened. Who would abandon children this young in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a storm? The thought made her stomach churn. Marcus disappeared into the kitchen to make something warm for the children, and Claire sat on the couch beside them, watching their small chests rise and fall as they slept. It was the first time they had stopped trembling since she'd found them, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in danger. She had been on the streets long enough to know that trouble never stayed far behind. While Marcus busied himself with preparing soup, Claire's eyes drifted to the small TV in the corner of the room. Marcus always kept it tuned to the local news, mostly to stay aware of the city's growing dangers. The news anchor's voice was a low hum in the background until something she said made Claire freeze. In a breaking development, authorities continue the search for two missing toddlers, last seen earlier this week. The children, both under 3 years old, are believed to be victims of a human trafficking ring operating in the city. The police are asking for any information. Claire's heart stopped. She whipped around to stare at the screen. On the television was a photo of the same two children now sleeping next to her. The grainy image, taken before they were abandoned, showed them dressed in clean, colorful clothes, their faces bright and full of life. But there was no mistaking it. The curly-haired girl and the boy in the photo were the same children she had found in the duffel bag. "Oh my God," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the thumping of her heart. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen. "Marcus, Marcus, come here." Marcus rushed over, wiping his hands on a towel, his eyes narrowing as he followed her gaze. The news broadcast continued, detailing the trafficking ring's possible connections to local criminal organizations. Marcus swore under his breath as the horrifying reality sank in. "They're part of a trafficking ring," Claire said, her voice trembling with shock. Someone took them, and they were going to." She couldn't finish the thought. It was too awful, too terrifying to imagine what might have happened if she hadn't found them. Marcus stood beside her, silent for a moment, his face pale. "We need to call someone." "The police." "No," Claire said immediately, her voice sharper than she intended. She glanced at the children, still fast asleep. If this is a trafficking ring, who knows how deep it goes? What if the people involved have ties to the cops? Marcus looked at her, eyebrows raised. Claire, we can't just hide them here. It's too dangerous. I know, she said, running a hand through her wet hair, her mind spinning. But we need to be careful. If we go to the wrong person, they could take them back. We need to figure out who we can trust. Marcus was silent, but his eyes told Claire he understood. They had both lived too long on the fringes of society to believe in easy solutions. Trusting the wrong person could get them killed. Or worse, get the children handed right back to the monsters who had taken them in the first place. We need help, Marcus finally said. But not from just anyone. Claire nodded, her thoughts still swirling. There's got to be someone out there. Someone who's not corrupt, who can actually help. But who? Who could they trust in a city where everything seemed rotten? As if on cue, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and frowned at the screen. It's a message from an old contact, he said, his voice dropping. They've got information on the trafficking ring. They say we need to be careful. There's someone high up involved. A city official. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. So it's bigger than just a few criminals. If we expose this, Marcus finished her thought, we'll be putting a target on our backs. The room fell silent, save for the soft sound of rain outside and the faint hum of the TV. Claire glanced down at the children again, their small bodies curled up in the blanket. A fierce protectiveness rose within her. She had to keep them safe, no matter what. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice steadier now. But we can't let them fall back into the wrong hands. Marcus nodded, but Claire could see the worry in his eyes. They were both in over their heads now, tangled in something far more dangerous than either of them had ever faced. But they had no choice. They had to protect the children, no matter the cost. The air in the shelter felt thick, weighed down by the tension of the revelation from the news. Claire and Marcus sat in silence, their minds racing, the two toddlers still asleep on the couch beside them. The soft hum of the city outside, punctuated by the distant sounds of sirens, only added to the sense of looming danger. Marcus stood suddenly, his face grim. We can't keep them here, Claire. We've stumbled into something huge, and it's not safe for them, or for us. Claire nodded, her stomach knotting with fear. I know, but what do we do? If we take them to the authorities, and they're compromised. We don't take them to just anyone, Marcus interrupted, his voice low but firm. I've been in touch with someone who might help. A private investigator, Nathan Scott. He's clean, but he's wary. We'll need to move carefully. Claire swallowed hard. The idea of involving anyone else made her nervous, but they were out of options. Can we trust him? Marcus hesitated, looking conflicted. I've worked with him before. He's got connections, but he's been burned by the system too. If anyone can get us out of this without dragging us down, it's him. Before Claire could respond, there was a knock at the door. 3 short raps, then silence. Both Claire and Marcus froze. No one knocked on the shelter's door this late unless they were in trouble, or worse, bringing it with them. Marcus signaled for Claire to stay quiet, then moved cautiously toward the door. He opened it just a crack, enough to see who was outside, but not enough to let them in. To Claire's surprise, a man's voice filtered through, calm but serious. Marcus, it's Nathan Scott. I'm here about your message. Marcus visibly relaxed and opened the door wider, revealing a tall, dark-haired man in his mid-30s, dressed in a long coat, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the room. Claire could see that he wasn't just some street hustler or amateur. He carried himself like someone who had seen too much of the world and survived it. Come in, Marcus said, stepping aside. But Nathan shook his head. No time for formalities, Nathan said curtly, glancing down at the sleeping children before looking back at Marcus. We need to talk. Now. Claire stood, feeling a prickle of anxiety at Nathan's intensity. We're in danger, aren't we? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's gaze shifted to her, his expression unreadable. You are, and so are those kids. The ring that took them. It's not some small-time operation. They've got connections all the way up. City officials, cops, even some judges. That's why I came. We've got to be smart about this, or they'll come for you, and no one will stop them. Claire's heart raced. What do we do? We can't just hide forever. No, Nathan agreed. Hiding isn't going to work. They're already looking for the kids, and when they find out they're here, they'll come hard. Marcus frowned. How did they even know we have them? Nathan's jaw tightened. I have sources. Someone's been watching you, and from what I've gathered, you've got a mole. Someone in your circle is feeding information to the wrong people. Claire's blood ran cold. A mole? Among the few people they trusted? Marcus looked just as shaken. Who could it be? We've kept a low profile for years. Nathan glanced between them, his eyes hard. That's what you need to figure out. Fast. These people don't play games. They'll use anyone and anything to get what they want. A heavy silence settled over the room. Claire's mind raced, running through the handful of people she and Marcus knew who were close enough to betray them. It didn't make sense. Everyone at the shelter was desperate, but they were like family. They relied on each other just to survive. Before she could process it further, Nathan stepped closer. We have to move now. Get those kids somewhere safe. But you need to know that once they find out who's been hiding them, they'll come after you. I can help, but you have to be smart about this. Claire's throat tightened. Where do we go? How do we stay ahead of them? Nathan's expression softened, though his voice remained firm. I know of a safe house. It's remote, out of the city, and off the radar. You can lay low there while I figure out who we can trust and who we can't. But if you stay here, he trailed off, letting the unspoken threat hang in the air. Claire looked at Marcus, who gave her a small nod of agreement. They didn't have a choice. The shelter was compromised, and whoever was after the children wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But the thought of running, of leaving everything behind, terrified her. She had lived on the streets long enough to know that running only bought you time, not safety. But for the sake of the children, she couldn't afford to hesitate. All right, Claire said, her voice trembling but resolute. We'll go. Nathan gave a quick nod and glanced out the window, his body tense. We have to move now, under the cover of night. Get only what you need. Claire and Marcus moved quickly, gathering supplies while Nathan kept watch by the door. As Claire stuffed blankets and food into a bag, a thought gnawed at the back of her mind. Who could the mole be? There weren't many people left in their circle. Could it be someone from Marcus's side? Or worse, someone from hers? Just as she slung the bag over her shoulder, a faint noise reached her ears, tires on wet pavement, approaching fast. Claire's heart dropped into her stomach. She darted to the window, peering through the blinds just in time to see a black SUV pull up at the end of the alley. Nathan, she hissed, her voice laced with panic. They're here. Nathan cursed under his breath and pulled a gun from his coat, checking the magazine before stepping toward the door. No time to wait. We go now. Marcus hurried to the children, scooping them up into his arms as they stirred, still half asleep and unaware of the danger closing in around them. Claire grabbed her bag and ran to the back door, adrenaline surging through her veins. We need to lose them, Nathan said, his voice low but urgent. Head through the alley and stay close. They moved swiftly, Claire's heart pounding with every step. Behind them, the sounds of footsteps and muffled voices filled the air, and she knew it wouldn't be long before whoever was after them realized they were on the run. As they slipped through the maze of darkened alleys, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by their pursuers, but by someone much closer, someone who had betrayed them. And as they disappeared into the night, Claire's mind churned with the terrifying thought. Whoever the mole was, they had to figure it out soon. Because if they didn't, there would be no safe place left to run. The cold night air cut through Claire's soaked clothes as she ran, clutching the bag of supplies to her chest. Behind her, Marcus carried the children, their tiny heads resting against his shoulders, still too tired and scared to understand what was happening. Nathan led the way through the dark alleys, his gun drawn, every step calculated, every turn deliberate. The sound of footsteps echoed off the brick walls behind them, closer now. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as panic tightened its grip around her. The black SUV had been no coincidence. They were being hunted. and whoever was coming wasn't going to stop until they had the children back. "Keep moving," Nathan hissed, his voice urgent but steady. "We're almost at the rendezvous point." Claire's legs burned from the effort of running, her lungs heaving with every breath. She wanted to collapse, but the thought of the children kept her going. She had to be strong. For them, the memory of their terrified faces when she found them still haunted her. Whatever horrors they had escaped from, she wouldn't let them fall back into it. They rounded a corner, the alley narrowing into a dark passage that led toward the outskirts of the city. Claire could hear the roaring engines of the pursuing vehicles as they raced down the streets, searching for them. Time was running out. Nathan stopped abruptly in front of a rusted metal gate at the end of the alley. He fumbled with a set of keys, his hands moving quickly but deliberately as he unlocked it. The gate groaned as it swung open, revealing a narrow path that led into a cluster of abandoned buildings. "This way," Nathan muttered, waving them through before pulling the gate shut behind them. He locked it quickly, hoping to buy them a few extra minutes. The safe house was close, hidden deep within the forgotten parts of the city. It was an old factory building, long since abandoned and rotting away, but it had one advantage. It was invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. "Stay low, stay quiet," Nathan ordered as they moved through the maze of broken walls and collapsed structures. The sounds of pursuit were further away now, but they were still out there, searching, hunting. Claire could hear the faint echo of voices and the distant rumble of engines. Finally, they reached the safe house, a low, crumbling structure with boarded-up windows and vines crawling up its sides. Nathan signaled for them to enter quickly. Claire ducked inside, the smell of mildew and dust filling her nose as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. Marcus followed, gently laying the still-sleeping children on a pile of blankets Nathan had stashed there earlier. "Is this place secure?" Marcus asked, his voice a harsh whisper. His eyes scanned the room, wary, anxious. "It's as safe as it gets," Nathan replied, peering out through a crack in the wall to check the street. "They won't find us here right away." "But we don't have long." Claire leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Every noise outside made her flinch. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan turned to her, his face grim. "We wait, just for a few hours. Then we move again. I have a contact outside the city who can help us disappear for good. But first, we need to make sure we're not being followed." Marcus crouched beside the children, checking on them as they stirred slightly in their sleep. "And what about the mole?" he asked quietly, his eyes still scanning the dark corners of the room. Nathan's jaw clenched. "We'll deal with that once we're safe. But for now, the priority is getting out of here alive." The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. Claire hugged her knees to her chest, her mind racing. Who could it be? Who had betrayed them? She had trusted so few people, and yet, someone had given them away. She couldn't stop the gnawing feeling that whoever it was might still be close, still watching them, still feeding information to the traffickers. Nathan crouched down next to her, his voice low. "I know you're scared, but we'll get through this. You did the right thing by bringing the kids to Marcus. We'll get them somewhere safe." Claire nodded, though doubt gnawed at her insides. Could they really outrun this? Could they protect the children from an enemy that seemed to be everywhere? Suddenly, a loud crash echoed outside, the sound of metal clattering to the ground. Claire's heart leapt into her throat. Nathan bolted to the window, peering through the crack, his face hardening. "They're here," he whispered. "They found us." Marcus stood, his face pale but determined. "We have to go now." "No," Nathan said firmly. "We can't run again. They'll just catch up. We need to outsmart them." He turned to Claire and Marcus, his eyes cold with calculation. "There's a back exit. You and Marcus take the kids and go. I'll stay behind and create a diversion. Lead them away." "No," Claire protested, her voice panicked. "You'll get yourself killed." Nathan shook his head, already pulling out his gun and checking the clip. "I've dealt with worse than this. Trust me, this is the only way. You need to get those kids out of here." Marcus hesitated, clearly torn between staying to fight and protecting the children. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. Nathan gave him a small, grim smile. It's what I do. Go. There was no time for further argument. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder, closer. Claire grabbed the bag, and Marcus quickly scooped the children into his arms, their sleepy protests silenced by his urgent whispers. Nathan led them to the back exit, a narrow door concealed by debris. He turned to Claire one last time, his voice low but intense. You get those kids to safety, and don't stop running until you're far away from here. Claire nodded, her heart heavy with dread. Thank you, she whispered. Nathan gave her a tight nod before slipping back into the shadows of the building, his gun ready as he prepared to lead their pursuers away. Marcus pushed open the door, and they slipped out into the cold night once more. Claire's legs felt like lead as they moved, but she forced herself to keep going. There was no choice. They had to keep moving. Behind them, they heard the unmistakable sound of gunshots, Nathan's diversion in full force. But it wasn't just the sound of the gunfire that made Claire's blood run cold. It was the voice she heard just before they disappeared into the alley, carried on the wind like a dark omen. We know you're here. You can't run forever. Whoever was after them, they were close. And whoever had betrayed them was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. As Claire, Marcus, and the children slipped further into the darkness, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The chase had only just begun. The cold night gave way to the soft glow of dawn as Claire, Marcus, and the children reached the outskirts of the city. The distant gunfire had long since faded, but the terror still clung to Claire's bones. Her muscles ached, her lungs burned, and every nerve in her body screamed for rest. But there was no time to stop. Not yet. They had reached the edge of a forest that bordered the city. It was dense, dark, and foreboding, an ideal place to disappear. Nathan's plan had worked for now, but Claire knew they were far from safe. The traffickers were still out there, hunting them, and the mole, whoever they were, had undoubtedly given up their location. Marcus, cradling the children in his arms, glanced at Claire, his face pale and weary. We need to hide for a while. Let things cool down. Claire nodded, her eyes scanning the forest. Nathan said he had a contact outside the city. We need to find them and figure out our next move. We can't keep running forever. They moved deeper into the forest, the dense canopy above providing some protection from prying eyes. It was eerily quiet, the only sounds the soft crunch of their footsteps on the forest floor and the occasional rustling of leaves. The children were still asleep, their tiny faces peaceful for the first time since Claire had found them. It gave her a small sense of comfort. At least they were safe for now. As the sun began to rise higher in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, they finally came upon an old, abandoned cabin nestled deep within the forest. It was small and dilapidated, with broken windows and a sagging roof, but it would serve as a temporary refuge. Marcus set the children down on a dusty blanket while Claire inspected the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was hidden. That was all that mattered. They settled in, exhaustion finally catching up to them. Claire sat against the wall, her mind racing. The events of the past few days had unfolded so quickly that she hadn't had a chance to process everything. But now, as the silence of the forest surrounded them, the weight of their situation came crashing down. We need a plan, Marcus said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. We can't stay here forever. Claire looked at him, her thoughts still tangled. Nathan said he was going to lead them away, but we don't know if he's okay. We don't even know if he made it out alive. Marcus nodded solemnly. We have to assume he's bought us some time, but we can't rely on that forever. We need to expose the people behind this. Claire knew he was right, but the idea of confronting the trafficking ring head-on filled her with dread. She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't a hero. She had barely been surviving before all of this. But then she looked at the children, innocent, defenseless, and caught in the middle of something far bigger than they could understand. She couldn't let them fall back into the hands of those monsters. She had to do something. We need evidence, Claire said, her voice steadier now. Something we can use to blow this wide open. If we can expose the city official behind this, we'll have a chance. Marcus hesitated. It's risky, Claire. These people are powerful. They'll do anything to protect themselves. I know, Claire replied, but we can't keep running. If we want to protect these kids, we have to bring them down. Just as she finished speaking, Marcus's phone buzzed, an encrypted message from Nathan. Meet at the warehouse on Dock 47. Midnight. It's time. Claire and Marcus exchanged glances, their shared fear and determination unspoken but palpable. Nathan was alive, and he was calling them to the final showdown. That night, Claire's heart pounded in her chest as they made their way to the warehouse at Dock 47. It was the dead of night, and the docks were eerily quiet, the sound of water lapping against the wooden beams the only thing breaking the silence. The children were safely hidden with one of Marcus's most trusted contacts, a place so off the grid that even Claire didn't know where it was. As they approached the warehouse, Nathan emerged from the shadows, his face tense but focused. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I've got the evidence. Enough to take down the official and expose the trafficking ring. But it's going to take guts to deliver it." "What kind of evidence?" Claire asked, her nerves frayed from the tension. Nathan pulled a small USB drive from his pocket. Financial records, phone taps, and internal documents. Enough to prove the city officials' involvement. But it won't mean anything unless we get it to someone who can act on it. And fast. "Who can we trust?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with doubt. "Everyone's in on this." Nathan's eyes darkened. "Not everyone. I've got a contact in the press. She's clean and she's been after this story for years. If we can get this to her, she'll blow it wide open." The plan was simple. Get the evidence to the journalist before the traffickers caught up with them. But nothing about their situation felt simple. They knew the risks. They could be ambushed, betrayed, or worse. But there was no other choice. The final hours felt like a blur. Claire, Marcus, and Nathan moved quickly, staying in the shadows as they made their way to the meeting point with the journalist. The city streets were deserted, but the feeling of being watched never left them. When they arrived, the journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, was already waiting in a nondescript car. Nathan handed her the USB drive through the window, his voice steady but urgent. "This is it. Everything you need. Get it out there. Expose them." Lisa nodded, her expression grim. "I will. But you need to disappear. Once this goes live, they'll come for you." "We know," Claire said softly, her stomach churning with anxiety. "But it's the only way." As the journalist sped away into the night, Nathan turned to Claire and Marcus. "We've done all we can. Now it's up to her." They didn't have to wait long. The next morning, the news exploded. Headlines filled with revelations of a massive human trafficking operation, linked to powerful officials and criminal syndicates. The city was in uproar. Arrests were made, and the traffickers were exposed, their grip on the city broken. The children, safe and sound, were reunited with their families, who had been frantically searching for them. Claire watched from afar as the tearful reunions took place, a heavy weight lifting from her shoulders. But the victory came with a price. Nathan disappeared into the shadows, his work done but his future uncertain. Marcus returned to the shelter, but things would never be the same. The betrayal, the danger, they had left scars that would take time to heal. And Claire, who had once lived in the shadows, had found something new. A purpose. She wasn't the woman she used to be, the broken soul drifting through life. She had faced danger, fought for something bigger than herself, and emerged stronger. As she stood on the rooftop of a building overlooking the city, watching the sunrise break through the horizon, Claire knew she would never return to her old life. This was a new beginning, a life rebuilt, not from the ashes of her past, but from the strength she had discovered within. The city, once filled with fear and shadows, now felt like a place of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Claire felt hope. Don't miss out on more thrilling stories packed with suspense, twists, and unforgettable characters. Subscribe now and be the first to dive into each gripping chapter, where every moment keeps you on the edge of your seat.